March 1943, Fairbanks, Alaska. The cold here is different from the Siberian plains, wetter, heavier, clinging to the skin like a damp cloth pressed against the face. Inside Ladfield's mess hall, the air smells of coffee, butter, and something the Soviet pilots cannot immediately identify. Yeast, sugar, warmth. Captain Valentina Gryzodubova stands at the threshold, her leather flight jacket still stiff with frost, her eyes scanning the American airmen seated at long wooden tables. They eat with a casualness that seems almost obscene. Plates piled high, no rationing cards, no cues, no calculations of who gets what and when. She turns to her comrades, Senior Lieutenant Nina Raspopova and Junior Lieutenant Galina Brok-Beltsova, and in Russian she mutters a single word that carries the weight of 1,000 winter mornings in Stalingrad. Decadence. They laugh, quietly at first, then louder, drawing glances from the Americans who do not understand the language but recognize the tone. It is the laughter of soldiers who have survived siege, who have eaten boiled leather and called it soup, who have rationed their last cigarette into thirds and smoked it over 3 nights. It is the laughter of women who flew antiquated biplanes through German flak, who were given no parachutes because their commanders believed the weight would slow them down, who earned their wings not through privilege, but through blood and relentless, brutal competence. And now, standing in this American base where men eat eggs and bacon as if war were a distant rumor, they laugh because the absurdity is too vast to process any other way. But the bread changes everything. To understand what happened in that mess hall in March 1943, one must first understand what bread meant in the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War. Bread was not food. It was currency, morale, survival, and ideology compressed into a single, dense block of sustenance. The siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 and would last 872 days, reduced the daily bread ration to 125 grams per person, a piece roughly the size of a deck of cards, half sawdust, half flour, baked with cellulose and cottonseed cake because grain had become a memory. Citizens died in the streets clutching their ration cards. Mothers fed their children first and starved quietly in the night. Bread was the line between existence and oblivion. The Soviet pilots arriving in Alaska in early 1943 were part of the Lend-Lease program, a logistical marvel that saw American-manufactured aircraft flown from factories in the United States across the Bering Strait to the Soviet Union via the Alaska-Siberia air route, known as ALSIB. Between 1942 and 1945, nearly 8,000 aircraft would make this journey. P-39 Airacobras, A-20 Havocs, C-47 Skytrains, along with tons of supplies, vehicles, and equipment. The Soviet ferry pilots, including a contingent of women from the legendary all-female aviation regiments, would fly these planes across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, the subarctic wilderness of Alaska, the Yukon Territory, and Siberia, where temperatures could plummet to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, and navigation relied on dead reckoning and sheer instinct. These women were not novices. They belonged to the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the latter known to the Germans as the Nachthexen, the Night Witches, who flew obsolete PO-2 biplanes on nightly harassment raids, gliding with their engines cut to drop bombs silently onto enemy positions. Valentina Gryzodubova, who stood at that threshold in Fairbanks, was already a hero of the Soviet Union, having set a world record for non-stop long-distance flight in 1938. Her comrades had logged thousands of combat hours. They had seen their friends burn alive in cockpits. They had flown through smoke so thick it turned day into night. They had landed planes held together by prayer and baling wire. And they had been hungry. Not the hunger of a missed meal, but the hunger that hollows out the body from the inside, that turns thoughts sluggish and makes the simplest tasks, checking instruments, pulling the stick, into acts of monumental will. They had learned to ignore it, to compartmentalize it, to mock it. Hunger, like fear, was an enemy you could not afford to acknowledge. So when they arrived at Ladd Field and were led into the mess hall for their first American meal, they expected hardship dressed up as hospitality. They expected the thin gruel of wartime rationing, the beets and cabbage that defined Soviet military cuisine, perhaps with a few extra ounces to demonstrate Allied generosity. They expected propaganda, a performance of abundance designed to impress, to show Soviet pilots that America too could endure. What they did not expect was sincerity. The mess sergeant, a broad-shouldered man from Iowa named Harold Jensen, gestured toward the serving line with the easy confidence of someone who had never known famine. He spoke through an interpreter, a Russian-speaking American lieutenant, and told them to take whatever they wanted. No limits, no cards, just food. The pilots exchanged glances. Valentina raised an eyebrow. Nina smirked. This was either a joke or a test. They moved through the line, watching American airmen pile eggs, sausages, fried potatoes, and slabs of ham onto their trays. A cook offered Galina a ladle of oatmeal, thick and steaming, topped with a dollop of butter that melted into golden rivulets. Another placed 4 strips of bacon on Nina's plate without asking if she wanted them. The sheer casualness of it, the assumption that food could be abundant, felt like a violation of natural law. But it was the bread that stopped them. At the end of the line sat a basket piled high with loaves, white bread, soft and pillowy, still warm from the oven. The crust was golden, barely crisp, yielding to the slightest pressure. The interior was airy, almost weightless, nothing like the dense, dark rye of the Soviet ration. Steam curled from a loaf that had been torn open, and the smell, yeast, butter, a faint sweetness, filled the space around it like a presence. Valentina picked up a slice. It was so soft it compressed under her fingers. She held it to her nose and inhaled. For a moment, the mess hall disappeared. She was 8 years old again, in her grandmother's kitchen in the Urals before the famines, before collectivization, when bread was something made with care and eaten with joy. She was 22, in Moscow, celebrating her record-setting flight with champagne and fresh pastries. She was nowhere and everywhere, suspended in a moment that felt stolen from another life. She took a bite. The texture was unlike anything she had tasted in 3 years of war. It dissolved on her tongue, soft and faintly sweet, the butter adding richness, the salt balancing the flavor. It was not the bread of survival. It was the bread of plenty, of peace, of a world where resources were not calculated down to the gram. It was the bread of a nation that could afford to waste. Nina and Galina were watching her. Valentina swallowed, then looked at them and said nothing. She took another slice. They sat at a table in silence, the 3 of them, surrounded by the noise of the mess hall, the clatter of forks, the hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. They ate the bread slowly, methodically, as if trying to decode a message written in flour and water. Around them, American pilots ate with the unconscious ease of men who had never questioned where their next meal would come from. They joked, they complained about the cold. They talked about baseball, about letters from home, about the P-39s they would be ferrying in the morning. The Soviet pilots said nothing. They ate, and in the eating something shifted. It is important to note what did not happen in that moment. They did not abandon their ideology. They did not suddenly embrace capitalism or question the righteousness of the Soviet cause. They did not betray their comrades or their country. But they encountered, perhaps for the first time, a tangible manifestation of the difference between the two systems, not in speeches or propaganda, but in the simple, undeniable fact of bread, that was soft and plentiful, and given freely. The Soviet Union had taught them to endure. America, it seemed, did not believe endurance was necessary. Historical records from the Lend-Lease program document the shock that Soviet personnel experienced when confronted with American material abundance. Lieutenant Colonel Georgy Zakharov, who oversaw Soviet ferry operations along the Alsib route, wrote in his memoirs that the hardest part of his job was not the flying, but managing the psychological impact on his pilots after their exposure to American bases. He noted that some pilots became withdrawn, others defensive, and a few openly questioned why, if the Soviet Union was winning the war, its people were starving, while American soldiers had coffee and fresh cream. The Communist Party anticipated this problem. Political officers accompanied every ferry flight, and upon returning to Soviet airspace, pilots were debriefed not just on aircraft performance, but on their interactions with Americans. They were reminded that American abundance was built on exploitation, that it was temporary, that it relied on the labor of oppressed workers and colonized peoples. They were told that Soviet rationing was a necessary sacrifice for victory, a shared burden that proved the superiority of collective sacrifice over individualistic excess. Some pilots accepted this, others did not. But all of them remembered the bread. Valentina Grizodubova's experience was not unique. Across Lad Field and other Lend-Lease transfer points, Soviet airmen and airwomen encountered American food culture with a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and hunger. Major Ivan Nagoda, a veteran pilot who had flown in the Spanish Civil War, wrote in a letter to his wife that the Americans ate meat 3 times a day and complained if the coffee was cold. He described this with a tone of bemused contempt, but the letter also mentioned that he had gained 8 pounds in 3 weeks. Lieutenant Zoya Pozhidayeva, another night witch, kept a diary during her time in Alaska. An entry from April 1943 reads, "They offered me a second helping. A second helping! I did not know whether to laugh or cry. I took it. I am not proud." The bread became a symbol, not intentionally, not through any deliberate propaganda effort, but through its simple, persistent presence. Every morning in the mess hall, there it was, fresh, warm, abundant. The Soviet pilots began to anticipate it. Some took extra slices, wrapping them in napkins to eat later, a habit born from years of scarcity. Others ate it slowly, savoring each bite as if trying to memorize the taste. The American airmen noticed. They did not understand the significance, but they saw the way the Soviet pilots looked at the bread, the reverence with which they handled it. Sergeant Jensen, the mess cook, began baking extra loaves specifically for the Soviet contingent. He did not make a show of it, he simply ensured that the basket was always full when they arrived. This small act of generosity, unremarked upon and unrecorded in official documents, represented something larger. It was the difference between a system that hoarded resources and one that assumed their availability. It was the gap between survival and comfort, between ideology and lived experience. But generosity, in wartime, is never simple. The United States was not feeding Soviet pilots out of pure altruism. Lend-Lease was strategic, a calculated investment designed to keep the Soviet Union in the war and bleed the Wehrmacht dry on the Eastern Front. Every P-39 delivered, every ton of Spam shipped, every loaf of bread served was part of a larger calculus. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that American material superiority was a weapon as potent as any bomber or tank. If Soviet soldiers could be fed, equipped and sustained by American production, they would fight harder, last longer, and require fewer American lives to achieve victory. The bread was politics, but it was also bread. By May 1943, the Soviet ferry pilots had completed their training and were preparing to return to the Soviet Union with their first squadron of aircraft. The night before their departure, Sergeant Jensen organized a small farewell dinner. He baked a special batch of bread, using real butter and honey, a luxury even by American standards. He placed the loaves on the table with a handwritten note in fractured Russian. "For the brave women of the sky." Valentina Grizodyubova read the note aloud to her comrades. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Nina Raspopova raised a cup of coffee, real coffee, another American luxury, and offered a toast in Russian. The interpreter translated. "To bread, and to those who bake it. May we all live to eat it in peace. The Americans raised their cups. They did not understand the weight behind the words, the years of hunger and loss compressed into that single sentence, but they understood the gesture. They drank. The following morning, the Soviet pilots climbed into their P-39s and began the long journey home. They flew over the wilderness of Alaska, across the Bering Strait, and into Siberia, navigating by compass and instinct. The planes were machines of war, but they also carried something else: the memory of warmth, of plenty, of bread that was soft and sweet and given freely. When they landed in Krasnoyarsk, they were met by political officers who conducted the mandatory debriefings. They asked about aircraft performance, about American military capabilities, about conversations with American personnel, and they asked, carefully, about the food. Valentina answered honestly. She described the eggs, the bacon, the oatmeal, and she described the bread. The officer made notes. He reminded her that such abundance was the result of capitalist exploitation, that American workers suffered while their bosses grew fat. He asked if she had seen evidence of inequality, of poverty, of racial injustice. She had not. She had seen only the mess hall, the flight line, the barracks, but she nodded and agreed that yes, of course, such things must exist. She was a loyal Soviet citizen, a hero of the Soviet Union, a decorated pilot. She understood the importance of ideological discipline, but she also remembered the bread. Over the next 2 years, Valentina Grizodubova and her comrades flew hundreds of combat missions. They shot down German planes, bombed enemy positions, and ferried supplies to besieged cities. They lost friends. They survived crashes. They endured cold, fear, exhaustion, and hunger. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, they talked about Alaska. They talked about the mess hall, the coffee, the casual abundance. And they talked about the bread. It became a shorthand, a private language. When rations were short, when the soup was thin and the bread was dense and dark, someone would say, "Remember Fairbanks?" And they would smile despite the hunger. The bread was not just food. It was proof that another world was possible, that scarcity was not inevitable, that somewhere people ate without calculating the cost. It was a glimpse of a life they had been told was decadent, wasteful, undeserving. And yet it had been real, and it had been kind. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between ideology and experience, was the unintended consequence of Lend-Lease. The Soviet government received the material aid it desperately needed, but it could not control the stories that came back with the pilots. It could not erase the memory of butter melting into oatmeal, of bacon given freely, of bread that was soft and warm and abundant. After the war, the Soviet Union moved quickly to suppress these stories. Veterans of the Lend-Lease program were discouraged from discussing their time in America. Some were reassigned. Others were quietly investigated for ideological deviation. The official narrative emphasized Soviet sacrifice and downplayed American contributions. Lend-Lease became a footnote, a minor detail in the grand story of Soviet victory. But the memories persisted. Valentina Grizodubova, in her later years, gave interviews about her wartime service. She spoke of her record-setting flights, her combat missions, her pride in the Soviet Union. She rarely mentioned Alaska. But when asked, once by a Western journalist, what had surprised her most about America, she paused for a long moment, then smiled and said, "The bread. I did not think bread could be so soft." It is tempting to see this story as a simple parable of capitalism versus communism, abundance versus scarcity, freedom versus oppression. But the truth is more complex. The Soviet pilots who ate American bread did not abandon their beliefs. They returned to the war. They fought with the same courage and ferocity. They believed, as they had always believed, in the righteousness of their cause. But belief and experience are not the same thing. And once you have tasted bread that is soft and sweet and given freely, once you have seen a world where food is not rationed and hunger is not assumed, you cannot forget. You carry that knowledge with you, a small seed planted in the mind, waiting for the right conditions to grow. The bread did not win the war. The Soviet Union's victory was earned through unimaginable sacrifice, through the deaths of 27 million people, through the grinding, brutal arithmetic of attrition. American aid helped, certainly, but it was Soviet blood that turned the tide. Yet wars are not only won with bullets and blood. They are won with ideas, with narratives, with the stories people tell themselves about who they are and what they are fighting for. And in the contest of narratives, in the quiet, undramatic struggle for hearts and minds, the bread mattered. Because the bread was not propaganda. It was not a speech or a poster or a promise. It was simply bread, soft and warm and real, offered without condition to soldiers who had learned to expect nothing. And in that simplicity, in that small, unremarkable act of generosity, lay a truth more powerful than any ideology. That a world without hunger is possible. That abundance need not be a fantasy. That people can be fed not because they are useful to the state, but because they are human. The Soviet pilots who laughed in that mess hall in March 1943 did not know they were witnessing the opening act of a longer struggle, one that would outlast the war and define the second half of the century. They did not know that the bread they ate would become, in the decades to come, a symbol of the promise and the peril of the West. A promise of prosperity and freedom, a peril of seduction and betrayal. But in that moment, they knew only what they tasted, and it was good. The war ended in May 1945. The Soviet Union celebrated victory, mourned its dead, and turned inward. The alliance with America dissolved into suspicion and hostility. The pilots who had flown the ALCB route were reassigned, their service classified, their stories buried beneath layers of official silence. But stories, like seeds, are resilient. They survive in unexpected places, in private conversations, in letters hidden in attic trunks, in the memories of children who asked their mothers, "What was it like in the war?" and received answers whispered late at night when the state could not hear. And in those whispered answers, sometimes there was bread, soft, warm, abundant, the bread that tasted like possibility, the bread that laughed at ideology, the bread that reminded soldiers, even in the darkest hours, that the world could be kinder than they had been taught to believe. March 1943, Fairbanks, Alaska. A mess hall smelling of coffee and yeast. 3 Soviet pilots standing at the threshold, laughing at American excess. And then, silence. The silence of discovery. The silence of something shifting, deep and unspoken, in the architecture of belief. They did not know it then, but they were tasting the future. And the future was soft and sweet and warm in their hands.